the fossils of our time, this very interesting testimony of extractivism of the Anthropocene. And I find that really interesting to present them as evidence, even as work of art, that I will relate to that in my talk. But I think I didn't know I would be talking in the middle of such a beautiful exhibition, but I'm really happy this is the case, because I will relate to that question of soil and what is in the soil during the talk. So let me start with the idea of extractivism. Let me start with the fossils that are around us. One of the starting point of our thinking with architects, of my thinking with architects, was the idea that we haven't only conquered the earth in terms of surfaces in a horizontal way, but also in depth. And this little diagram is an attempt at representing this conquest of the earth, but from the surface till the depth. This is one of the starting points of this idea of rediscovering the earth. The other starting point is, of course, the consequence of this conquest, which is the basically the various ways in which the earth reacts to those extractivist activities. Of course, this is only a diagram, but I was in Texas last week for a residency, and as you know, certainly there is a lot of fracking in Texas, and you can see the soil just suddenly disappearing. It's very, very impressive. So that was the starting point. The idea that basically today our conception of the earth is undergoing a radical shift. We understand that the space we inhabit is not an environment. As I said in my little presentation, it's not a container, but it's constantly produced by various forms of life, produced and built. And one of the things that interests me a lot and that I would like to discuss with you tonight, again, as architects, is in what way do we conceive of the human beings as builders next to other builders? I mean, we are architects, but we are not the only architects. How do we expand the idea of architecture, of building the earth? How do we expand it to other living beings? That's one of the things I'm interested in. So basically, we know nowadays it's the end of the COP27. It was completely a failure. We understand that this relationship to the earth is, as an unlimited resource, is not sustainable, that we live on a damaged planet, in the words of Anna Tsing. So these profound transformations in the way we conceive of our relationship with the earth have considerable philosophical, political, economic consequences. Yet we lack images to think about them. So the two projects I will tell you about tonight, related project, as I told you, because I brought for you the two books, Architecture, History of Science, and Theater, try to address this question of the lack of images. How do we produce not only images, but ways of thinking, ways of feeling that help us to tackle this changing relationship to the earth, but also this changing definition of the earth. So that's one of the sentences at the beginning of Terra Forma, which I just quote. If some of the phenomena we are witnessing, soil erosions, depletion of resources, acceleration of urban space-time, intensification of polluted areas, escape us by their scale, duration, and scope, it's through the development of our techniques of representation that we can hope to better understand them. And this idea of representation, then again, you can see the link between the idea of image and the question of theater, because that's terra forma that I will expand a little bit upon. And that's this old question of representing the earth on stage, which is one of my focus. Can the earth be a character or Gaia? Or under which condition can it be represented on stage? What do we need to do in terms of scale, modeling, images, stage direction to represent the earth for us? And of course, something which is beyond our scale, as you know. In a series of important articles, the historian, the great Indian historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, has argued that the particular temporalities involved in climate change and the Anthropocene are not only challenging our ways of life, but also our frameworks of knowledge production in the humanities and social sciences. The challenges, says Chakrabarty in his famous 2009 article, are particularly acute in relation to time scales and in relation to our definition to of human action. So the problem of space, the problem of time are related, of course, in this attempt to represent. But one might add that the very conditions of all our artifactual and artistic productions have been disrupted. We find ourselves powerless when confronted with the representations of long and more than human time that geologists invite us to imagine. This is because we need to reposition humans not only in relation to landscapes and species, as old-fashioned ecology did, but also in relation to geological timescales and geophysical forces. We have to consider an expanded timescale. We have to reach back into deep history and into the distant future. Hence, again, the extremely interesting aspect of these things. What happens to our garbage, basically, in terms of this deep time? And this is where the notion that Chakrabarty suggested, the notion of geohistory, is so interesting. It's, as you know, it's where the history of humans and the geological history meet. And this is one of the things we need to equip ourselves to understand. So at least two challenges of representation. First, how can we conceive, perceive, and experience ourselves as a geological force, as the geologists tell us we are? And second, how can we think of the earth as a stage shared by humans and non-humans, and more radically, as a space constantly made by different forms of life? This is this idea of architects, kind of non-humans architects, that I would like to suggest to you tonight. I don't know if you will agree at all. We can discuss afterwards. So the question really for me, ecology is completely linked to architecture, because we need to rethink what Anat Singh calls our arts of living, and what I would like to call, after her, our arts of inhabiting, our modes, ways, techniques, habits of inhabiting. And I'm really interested again, and I put all my questions at the beginning of my talk, all the questions for you to discuss afterwards. The concept of habitability, I'm really curious to know what you make of it. This is a big question at the moment in France, at the CNRS, in social sciences, but also in natural sciences and in earth system sciences. And at the moment, we try to discuss between geologists, social scientists, historians, artists, and they want to use sustainability and we want to use habitability. So I'm really curious to know what you think of that. Again, it's a little hint for discussion afterwards. So habitability, which I find really interesting as a concept, tries to grasp the question of our relationship to the Earth as a planet, our understanding of its space, and more precisely, our understanding of how human and non-human inhabitants participate in the making of its space. Hence the search for new ways of representing the Earth in relation to the new definitions given by Earth system sciences. I don't know what you know about ESS, Earth System Sciences. I think it's absolutely key for architects to know about ESS. Earth System Sciences is a developing field which actually make the link between more traditional disciplines such as chemistry, geophysics, geology, but also oceanography. And the reason why it becomes a new field, so to speak, that is because they realize that they can't divide anymore the biotic and abiotic spheres, the living and non-living things. You can't really understand the cycle of azote, I think you say nitrogen in English, if you don't consider together the living things and the non-living things. You can't consider the Earth as something dead, basically. You need to include other things. So you need to make the link between all those things. Why is it so interesting, so important, I think, for architecture? It's because soil is alive. So you can't really, you can't really think in terms of building if you don't reconsider completely the sciences that define the Earth and the matter, as you know. So how to represent the Earth in the context of this new Earth system sciences? Well, this is what, with my colleagues, Alexandra and Axel, this is what we call a Gaia-graphy. Gaia-graphy, what does that mean? It means how to write, how to draw Gaia, the Earth, through all the possible means and medium, theater, images, narratives, models, but we really need to equip ourselves. So what I will try to do tonight is to share with you some of the tools that we have tried, that we have experimented with in order to invent little new images. And one last thing before starting with those tools, I wanted to share with you this idea that we are in a context of a struggle between divergent representations of the Earth, and thus divergent representations of resources, of the material conditions of our existence. And this is highly political, of course. Stories and images are part of this struggle. If you represent the Earth as an inert territory, of course, it does not involve the same actions as making it multi-specific and shared territory. So how can we renew our modes of representation so that they are better adjusted to local situated processes? How can we make room in our mental and lived and built spaces for what has been excluded from it? These are the questions at the origin of the Terraforma project. So my co-authors, Alexandra Arène and Axel Grégoire, worked for 10 years in an architecture agency called BAZ. I think you might know it, based in France. And most of the time, as many of you, I guess, they were asked to work on ruined landscapes, on damaged territories, post-industrial sites, wastelands, polluted land. And the questions they had to solve was always how to re-inhabit these devastated landscapes. But they were very frustrated with the available tools. So what they did is that they accumulated data for 10 years and they tried to rethink their tools, because the tools they had were the traditional cartographic tools that were invented mostly between the 16th and the 18th century based on optical tools, surveying, measuring. And the other big tool, of course, I don't know that word in English, but it's cadastre. So what do you do with those tools? Those tools are beautiful. There is a great history of cartography of the bird eye view. And myself, as a historian of science, I've been fascinated by those images, cartographic images. But they have a little limitation. They have some problems, those tools. Why? Because the space they describe is an empty space. It's a space available to humans, which they can use and occupy. And one of the leading projects in Terraforma was, as I told you earlier, to make room for other entities, for the other architects, for the other builders. So to describe the Earth again in a different way meant, first of all, to try to fill the maps, you know, the white parts of the maps. Or, because our maps are very filled with roads, with cities, with geological sites, the idea was to bring back into our maps the multiple life forms that were excluded from the geographical and cartographical imagination. The idea was to explore the Earth again in order to inhabit a space which is already inhabited by others, non-human entities that share and shape the Earth with us, terraforming it. And of course, you will have noticed the shift in meaning that we are making with the term terraforming, with the title Terraforma. I have to admit that I loved science fiction for a while. So Terraforma is a big theme in science fiction, comics or films or books or novels. As you know, terraforming is generally conceived as an ultra-technical process. This is typically the terraforming of Mars, which is supposed to transform its atmosphere and its climate to make it habitable by humans. Here, on the contrary, we use the concept of terraforming in a completely counterintuitive way. It's defined as a terrestrial activity shared with other living beings. So that's the project, basically. The project is a thought experiment. Let's imagine that the Earth is not Mars, but that the Earth still is an unknown planet. Could it be discovered again differently? Could the images we have of it be renewed, at least in a little modest way, just to blur a little bit our knowledge of it? So like travelers, like the 17th century surveyors, we had to equip ourselves. But if we wanted to get out of the traditional cartographic and geographical imagination and references, we had to build new tools, like the ones used by the geologists today on the critical zone observatories, where Alexandra spent a few months. They have to build new tools. They make, I love that, they make laboratories which are outside of the universities. They call them wet lab or in situ lab. They really create those equipment tools in order to measure the Earth in new ways. So we did the same, but because I have this 17th century attraction, so to speak, I suggested my colleagues, Alexandra and Axel, to use this very beautiful 17th century book called Micrographia by Robert Hooke, which is a book that relates very much for me to our situation. It's a book in which Robert Hooke, one of the great scientists of the 17th century Royal Society in London, he says, look, in fact, we don't know the Earth. We have to rediscover it. let's discover a new Earth. And in order to discover a new Earth, and here you can, of course, hear that he's referring to the great discoveries of the 15th and 16th centuries. But he says, you don't need to go to India, to the America to discover a new Earth. Just look around you with new optical lenses. And this is what he does. He looks at moth or mushrooms or, you know, even a little ink point with his microscopes. And what he sees is amazing. It's landscapes, new things, new living things, new landscapes, new plants. So that was the idea, basically. Let's do like Hooke, equip ourselves with lenses. And this is our lenses, the Terraforma lenses. So if you have read it or seen it, I will not go into detail too much, but what I would like to share with you tonight, which is not in the book, is how did we make those tools? How did we build them? Because of course, building tools is always a kind of bricolage between old tools, new techniques of drawing. And again, I speak in front of architects, so you know all that much better than I do. But I was really interested in the idea of hacking the tools of architecture to do something else with them. I'm curious to know what you think of that. Anyway, like Hooke, we begin our book by showing our tools, and those tools are like new lenses through which territories are redrawn. So that's the seven models: soil, point of life, living landscape, borders, resources, space-time, memories. Each of them explore the way in which the living beings trace their territories, the way in which they cohabit, they develop borders, they adjust their rhythm of life. They are, in a way, models for redescribing territories, no longer through stable cartographic codes that show topographic elements, for instance, but through the movements of various forms of life. And again, I know this is quite typical, I think, for you as architect, how to include movement, how to include time, how to include time, space, how to include people in your representations. In fact, what we discovered, and it's quite obvious, is that those forms of life are as material as topography, but somehow we are not used to grasp them visually. We are surrounded by them, but we don't really draw them normally. So in a way, what we tried to do in Terraforma, and again, this is a project, so the book is just one moment of the project, and I will show you what happened since, because the book is from 2019, 2019. So there has been 3 years, and there has been lots of new projects, and I will tell you about that after my summary. So in a way, I was saying we try to move from a kind of stable topography to moving life forms, but taking them as a, I would say, new materialism. How do you materialize this building movement? So these are the conceptual tools, but then I would like to enter into the material tools, because the project is really to shift the gaze, to renew the tools of cartography by renewing its conceptual tools. And here you can see that we are not renewing the tools of architecture at all. We are using the tools of architecture to move a little bit the tools of cartography. I don't know if this is very orthodox, but this is what we did. And we are often invited in schools of architecture and not so often in school of geography or cartography. So maybe the project was not as well received, but that's another question. So how to renew the tools of cartography? Well, basically by having 3 impossible objectives: revealing an invisible world, and again, you can see the link with the 17th century microscopy; overcoming the flattening nature of cartography, and as I told you, repopulating the maps, and this is very important. So let's enter one of them. It's blurred, but it should, yeah, it's better now. What you can see here is not, again, it's not presented like that in the book. In the book, you have, first of all, a long description of the model, how it's made, because it's supposed to be used. And then there is a map. And here I've just put the 2 together so that you can see how the model make the map. The model is on the left and the map on the right. Of course, this is not a map. What is it? Is it a kind of diagram? I will try to share with you this making of the drawing. The first model takes the soil as a reference point. As I told you, the idea of changing our vision of the soil, our understanding of these things was absolutely key. What is in the soil? In what way those things coming from our civilization, coming from extractivism, how do they inhabit the soil with other living beings? And what does that mean? To take into consideration that not the soil as a surface, but the soil as a depth. I'm sure you know the work of Farinelli, for instance, this great Italian, is he an architect or a historian of architecture? He's the first person who made me realize that we always think of the soil as a surface. And in a way, it was a kind of challenge when I listened to him maybe 10 years ago saying that, okay, we should consider the soil as a depth. Then we thought, okay, what would that mean to represent it as a deep thing? As I told you, each map, so to speak, if you accept this word, is made with the data that Alexandra and Axel had collected in their field work as landscape architects. In this one, they worked for years in the chemical valley near Lyon, la vallée de la chimie à Lyon, which is, as you know, an extremely polluted area. So what is the way, what is the trick in this little image? Well, it works like an upturned globe. The atmosphere has been placed in the center and the deep earth at the periphery of the image. What is the aim of this little reversal? Well, it's a kind of anamorphosis then, because what is normally very thin is in our representation of the globe, which is this crust in which all the living things are, then suddenly it can be expanded and takes most of the image. And this crust, which has been somehow extended like a skin, is called, as you might know by the geologists, the critical zone. And the critical zone is very important, and you will see the link again between the theater plays I staged with Bruno Latour and that, because in fact, we've been obsessed with this concept of critical zone for years, and Terraforma and the performances are 2 different ways to try to feel this critical zone. So I'm sure most of you know the definition, but just to make sure that we are all on the same line, the critical zone is this very thin part of the earth where everything, where all the living things are and all the resources of the living things. So it's extremely critical in the sense that if the erosion continues, there's no way to survive. And there has been lots and lots of projects, scientific projects to equip, understand, measure the critical zone. And the critical zone is where you build as architect. This goes from the up atmosphere to the rocks. And this is our world, basically. So we think that our world is the planet, but our world is this very, very thin thing, which we use all the time. So how to represent this critical zone, how to give it the importance it has for our survival. So that was the first attempt. What it makes is that it tries to make the Earth visible as a palimpsest, as a layer, as a multiple layer. It tries to show the stratification of land use, and it also tries to reach to see how far the human influence goes. I don't know if you can see that here. Maybe it's not on this. It's on this one. We have added a volcano, which is of course not in Lyon, but just for the scale to see where it goes deep. And we have added, sorry, it's blurred because it's heavy, but it should be better soon. And we have added a nuclear waste as an example again of the depth of the human influence. What is interesting for us is that this model makes it possible to visually represent the constant flux between different levels of the ground. And so it makes it very fluid, you know, as if suddenly the soil was something like a liquid. And normally we don't associate the earth and the soil with this fluidity, liquidity. But in fact, when you go deep, you can see that a landslide has caused two strata to meet, two epochs that should never have met. And elsewhere, toxic substances infiltrate, they contaminate, as you know, deep groundwater. So it's a way to represent this kind of, how do you say, I want to say architecture souterraine, this kind of architecture of the subsoil. It's really like an architecture again. And one last thing I wanted to note with this little model is that the atmosphere becomes the black round at the center, which is again a way to remind us that the atmosphere is not something open. When we release something, of course, it remains. It's a completely closed system. We know that, of course, but just a little graphic reminder that the atmosphere is completely closed. I just, because again, you're architect, I just want to show you a few things about this chemical valley and the way in which the model works, like putting the kernel of the Earth at the margins and the atmosphere at the center. And that's the model itself. And of course, what is interesting now is how to apply it to different territories. If you need to explore somewhere which is especially, let's say, sensitive about the soil, is it interesting to represent the soil in that way instead of a cadastre? So now I will go quicker for the other models, but I just wanted to share with you this first transformation from the Earth seen as a globe to the Earth seen as a critical zone where the place, the space we inhabit is actually quite different in terms of imagination from the blue marble that we all know. The second little shift, and as you can see, Terra Forma is actually a series of little shifts in the mind, not more than that, but just changing the point of reference slightly in each chapter. The second change we try to make is the idea of point of view, which we love so much in architecture, in history of art, in theater as well. And as we know, as you know better than anybody, the point of view, the perspective is what allows the perspectivist construction of an image of reality. It's a distanced gaze that embraces a landscape. And in fact, our visualizations of the Earth are based on, as I told you earlier, cartographic images that do not really allow us to capture the challenges of the current ecological upheaval. Hence, what we try to do in this second model is to go from the point of view to the point of life. It works better in French, de point de vue au point de vie. The concept of point of life, point de vie, we borrowed it, we stole it from our friend Emanuele Coccia, the Italian philosopher, who considers each living thing as the starting point and considers that each living thing integrates the world in his or her or its own way. So that's what we try to do in this strange picture. At the margin, you have the skin, and at the center, you have the planet, the cosmos even. It's really the idea that it's almost a Leibnizian monad, if you do a little bit of philosophy. It's really the idea that all the world is contained in a way, in a point of life. I don't spend too much time on that, but I just show you what we make out of it. Then, if you consider that the space is made by points of life, not points of view, well, quite quickly, you can imagine that the space is actually made by combined points of life. And that's the next model. What we did for the next model, and then you'll see it get crazier and crazier, but if you follow me, we simply removed the background so that the topographical elements disappear. And now the background, because it's left free, it simply shows the relationship between living things and the territory. So the moving and living bodies become the driving force behind the map. They are the, as I told you, the points of life. So again, this is a rather liquid space, which is open to other circulations, new spaces of encounter. So the map, again, if this is a map, is an expression of the interactions between the different points of life. I just show you that. So this is supposed to be, and I find that always very strange and funny, but it is supposed to be a map of the Grand Paris. I will tell you at the end where this image comes from, but I'm sure you know that the reference. It's a kind of portulan, you know, the navigation maps of the 12th, 13th century. In the portulan, you had the place where the ports were, the boats were, which had our little white points. And then you have this big sea. But how do you find your way on the sea? Well, you can use winds or currents, and you need to know the attach point, so to speak. So I suggested to Axel and Alexandra to use this great reference to the portulan and to do a kind of portulan of Paris by using the port of each living things, and then you just follow them and you see where they encounter. Again, this is a bit abstract or very naive or both. But what I find interesting is the way in which it helps us a little bit conceptually to imagine the space not as something given, but as something made, constantly made. And again, this is more like a conceptual game than a map, obviously. So what we do here is to follow the movement and lifelines of humans and non-humans. And what is interesting for us is to consider not only that living beings move, because that would be a bit too obvious, but they manipulate air. They create the conditions for their survival. They create space. And again, this is this kind of reversal between inhabiting space as a contenant, I'm sure you understand contenant, or making space. And that's something which I find quite interesting, because it really comes from not only contemporary Earth system science, but it also comes from biology, for instance. The idea that space is created. So space is not a container, but a living landscape composed of superimpositions of actions of the beings that surround us. I move on. Just to show you a few models, that's the one for frontiers, where we try to reconsider frontier not as a line, but as an inhabited space. That's the one for space-time, but I think it's quite obvious for you. How do you represent the variety of space-time in a city? That's, for instance, the 10th arrondissement in Paris, where you have a projet, as you say, as architects. And how do you represent the fact that depending on where you are situated, on the Gare du Nord, Gare de l'Est, Quai de Gemap, Canal Saint-Martin, it's not the same space-time. So you have to try to represent that. But in a way, that's very Excel work. It's too complicated for me. And this one is about resources. This one I like, because again, it's a very naive way to represent a new vision of resources. The old vision was to put a kind of, to take one resource, like a forest or a mine, and to suck it out completely. And what we tried to do with our little drawings was to think in terms of knitting les points. How can you think of the resources as something which is all over the territory? And the last one, and then I will show you all the background images. The last one is about memory, and that goes back to the beginning in a way. I told you that, like most of you, Axel and Alexandra had to make projects on polluted areas. So one of the questions is, for how long is it impossible to inhabit this space? Une friche industrielle, a polluted area, of course, a nuclear waste site. So we tried to do this kind of boussole, compass, that can allow us to orientate ourselves. How long will it take to transform a bad sign into a good one, so to speak? How long does it take to re-inhabit the earth? Okay, now that's what I wanted to do, which was to show you the strange mix between those images and the history of science images. This one is, you might know it is by Kircher. And of course, it's quite different because it's a cross-section of the Earth. And it's quite different from, so that's the one about volcano, because Athanasius Kircher was absolutely obsessed by volcano. He even went into a few of them. And then he tried to represent this strange living organism. You can see how much it looks like an écorché, kind of 16th century engraving of an anatomical body. So it's like an écorché of the Earth. But what I find interesting is that, of course, you can see the link with that. But at the same time, it's very different because this is not a cross-section, so to speak. This is a globe, as I told you, upside down. But I have to admit that Kircher was always somewhere in our mind. I told you about Portulan navigation maps. This is one of the most famous one. This one as well. And you can maybe see the link with our own Portulan. But again, it's just a way to show you how historical images can be reused in a completely different way. And then this is John Cage or Kevin Lynch, kind of ways of noticing the music. And this is something we used a lot for the time-space thing. And of course, this is quite obvious that there should be some links between representing music, noticing music or movement or dance, and those new cartographic ideas. As you can see, this is like a score, basically. And this is 3 scores. I told you about the 10th arrondissement. You can maybe recognize the Gare du Nord, Gare de l'Est, Canal Saint-Martin, strange time-space interlocking. Okay, I promise I won't go too late, but I just wanted to show you as a way of concluding a few images of the plays, performances, conferences, I don't know how to call them, that I made with Bruno Latour in the last 10 years. And this is the little book Trilogie Terrestre that is going around. The only thing I wanted to say is that for me, theater is another way to explore in a very, as you can see, hypothetical way, to explore this new conception of space. And it's also a way to go back to the exhibition in a way. What do we do of this garbage that we are living in? What do we do of this reacting earth that Latour tells us about in Facing Gaia, for instance? This little photographs has been taken by him when he was going on tour with my theater company to Calgary, Canada, for one of our first plays together, which was called Gaia Global Circus. And he was on the plane, as you can see, and he was on the next to the Mer de Baffin, and he saw that looks like Munch, of course, face, le cri de Munch. And that's the starting point of the terrestrial trilogy, which is those three performances in which we try to tackle more or less the same questions as what I have just presented, but in a completely different way, with the tools not of architecture, not of images, but of theater. So I just share with you a few images of Bruno behind the Earth's rise. The idea in this first conference called Inside was to go inside the critical zone in a very literal way and to try to distance ourselves from the vision of the Earth as a globe, as the blue marble, even though we love those images. So there is this kind of game for me between those beloved images from the NASA, from the 60s, from the 70s, and the need to renew those images. This is the blue marble, again, with Bruno inside his images. Normally, he was doing, of course, like I do now, conferences with the image behind him. So the idea was just to put the philosopher in his PowerPoint, so to speak, or in the strata in this one. And the end of Inside is really like the beginning of Terraforma in a way, because it's where we were starting to draw little sketches of the critical zone. And so that's the last image. And then it became, so to speak, the soil map that I showed you. So for me, it's just different ways, again, to explore those questions. Of course, the whole point of this little performance, but also of Terraforma, is that not only we don't really have images for that, and we don't pretend that we are creating those new images, we're just approaching them. But the problem of those images is that they are blurred, they are difficult, they are not very attractive. And there is a game in the show about this difficulty to represent Gaia. Not only to represent Gaia, but to make it into an something aesthetically appealing. How do you make Gaia interesting? How do you make it attractive? How do you make it sexy, I want to say? Oh, this is recorded, but I mean, how do you change our gaze? How do you go from the gaze towards Mars or building on Mars? I've heard that some architects want to make buildings and cities on Mars. I hope you don't. How do you redirect the gaze towards the Earth when what we have as images is as blurred, as unattractive as that? You know, that's one of the challenges, I think. And that's one of the challenges that we didn't solve, obviously. This is Bruno showing you a blurred image of Gaia. So this is pre-Terraforma. This is before Terraforma. We really didn't have any idea. It was Alexandra again drawing something to speak about Gaia, which is not the globe, which is not the Earth we know. That's another show called Moving Earth, the second one, that tries to make the link between the 17th century and today, but I will not enter that discussion now, except if you ask me. But what is interesting here, you have Bruno looking at Lynn Margulis, who is one of the great biologists who completely transformed our conception of the living things, hence of the Earth. And this is Lynn Margulis showing us the making of Gaia, the Earth as something alive. And this one I like. It's a kind of Humboldt 19th century vision of the critical zone. And the very last show we made with Bruno before he died, as you know, last month, is called Viral. And Viral is this attempt at redirecting our gaze towards the terrestrial landscape. How do you go from Mars as a, you know, again, an attractor, back to Earth, which was one of the big questions we discussed for years with Bruno and our colleagues. And this is the last 17th century image I wanted to share with you, which I love, which is this kind of reversed Earth. And again, just the idea that throughout history, cartography has been so inventive, so creative, that it's interesting to mix different tools and periods of time to try to make new images again and again. And these are images that we have made with students after the Terraforma project. That was in Zurich, Versailles, Toulon, and Belfort. Lots and lots of students were using our models or inventing new models to create those images. And I think we just hope that they will continue to be, you know, to proliferate, to multiply, because the whole thing is to avoid any fixation, any stabilization of the representation, and to use, as you do as architects, drawings as ways of thinking and inventing new ways of inhabiting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frédérique, for this very rich presentation. We will let space for a question from the Zoom audience, but maybe we can start here if you have some reaction, comments, details that you would like to discuss. Yeah, maybe. No.
Thank you. I just had a question of understanding. You said that we should rethink our arts of living and inhabiting. And from this changing of the gaze, you said that sustainability versus inhabitability. And this is not very clear why you oppose those two terms to me. So this is the first question. And the second one would be, we often speak about coexisting. And is there a difference for you between co-inhabiting and coexisting?
The second one is difficult, so I will answer the first one first. Actually, this opposition is not something I made. It's something I discovered when working for this big CNRS project I told you about with colleagues coming from the natural sciences. They want to make a sustainable center for France because we don't have such thing. I think in Switzerland, you are much more advanced, like in Germany, for these kind of things. But the problem of sustainable, in French at least, is that it's been used by greenwashing business for years. So for social scientists, it's almost impossible to use it. Soutenabilité, sustainability, durabilité has been completely badly used. So I think the problem is not conceptual. The problem as often is greenwashing, is what do you do with the words which have been, used? Soutenability, what does that mean? Does that mean that we continue the same, but we just use nuclear resources? What do you sustain? Do you sustain our ways of life? Do you sustain, continuous economic growth? I mean, there is something difficult with the term, and I think I've heard today in the train that there is something starting a PhD on the history of sustainability and sustainable science. I thought, great, this is needed because we've been, I don't know, there has been some strange historical paths taken there. So I didn't really oppose them. I just want to say that today, at least in France, that's why I was asking you the question, the term habitability is something that we use more, with more interest in the social sciences, in philosophie de la nature, ecology, Anthropocene studies, because it says something which is immediately related to the conditions of life and survival, which sustainability somehow doesn't really, or can be used in a counter meaning. I don't know if I'm clear, but it's little problems of terminology which can be big political questions. Actually, that's why I just wanted to share with you that. The second one is about existing and habiting.
Yes, what is the difference between coexisting and co-inhabiting, if there is one?
I'm not sure I make any big difference of that. I'm not sure my speech was that specific.
You mentioned a lot inhabiting.
Yeah.
But we often, I think inhabiting is not that much of a term that is used yet. We are much more confronted with the coexisting word.
Okay,
so I was wondering if, is it a position to use this term instead?
No,
of
I think it's bad English.
No,
really. Oh, not only, but it's linked to the first question. It's linked to the fact that I use habitability as an important concept. So of course, inhabiting is important, but you're right. it's not the way you talk normally. You say coexisting. So it's a way to make in the word, to make the idea of habitability resonate a bit more. But I think the meaning is not different from coexisting. It's just a little focus on habitability, because habitability means inhabitability as well. You know, that's interesting. What is habitable? So it's not only coexisting, it's whether you can survive or not.
And that's why it's actually different.
So it's a bit different. Yeah. You're right.
Because you exist, but you inhabit the territory differently. I mean, it's two different presence.
Yeah, you're right. But then we are back to Sartre existentialism. Yeah. Maybe it's too much for tonight. But the question, it's very interesting. Let's try to think together about that, because one of the discussions I have with my colleagues in Paris, philosophers, and I told you about Emmanuel Kotcha or Nikolai Schultz, people like that, is basically in what way there is a kind of new existentialism. You know, those questions about habitability, in a way, they force us to redefine the question of the old philosophical question of existence. Existence is not only, you know, again, a Sartrean metaphysical question anymore. It's about survival. So I think it's quite interesting to rematerialize those old philosophical questions of existence. So if you rematerialize existentialism, what you find is, what are the conditions of a good life today? How can we survive together? So it's an expansion of coexisting, it's co-inhabiting. So thank you for the question. I think it's actually quite important to make the difference, because it's much less abstract. Coexisting means that you share resources, you share water, you take care of the soil, you take care of where we build, how, you know, it's basically reconsidering what we took for granted.
There's a question there. Just for Zoom, that's all.
Maybe just as a reaction to this, for me, inhabiting in the first reaction seems much more active. Inhabiting also means there's a habit, there's a way of arranging or adapting the space, while existing, I wouldn't have the same notion of having an active relation to the territory. So this might be also interesting to think about the activeness of both terms.
Yeah, thank you. It adds to the discussion a lot, because as I told you, one of the things we were interested in is the idea that you don't exist in space, you make the space. So absolutely, inhabiting has also this kind of active meaning. And not only we as humans, all the things around us, they make the space constantly. You're right.
Yeah. Please.
I have a small comment and then a small question. Following on the discussion we've already been having, and the question you posed in the beginning, what architects make of habitability versus sustainability. If I were to play the devil's advocate, I would say I'm not as optimistic about architects understanding the difference between these two terms and using the former rather than the latter in the way we discuss how we engage with our surroundings. And I think one of the frictions here is also the question of scale, because when architecture is being discussed, it's a completely different scale than what a planetary scale would be. And hence the question that follows this comment is, how do you see these models that you've sort of worked with being brought to a scale that is much more intimate, or much more, because inhabiting is an intimate word. When I inhabit a space, I deal with, say, 2 meters, 3 meters radius around me. And if I were to inhabit and make a map, then that map would only be of a room, say, or a piece of land. And if these models were then to to be used at that scale, how do you imagine this translation from a global scale to a smaller
Yeah,
scale?
this is a beautiful question. Thank you. Well, one way to answer you is to say that those models are not as global as they seem, because of course they have circles, which is, I think, one of the problems, but we couldn't get rid of the circle. So it looks global, but as I told you, it's very specific. I mean, it's one arrondissement in Paris. It's a certain valley. It's one point of life, but still it's quite big. You're right, and I like your remark on the fact that what we inhabit, if we are lucky enough to inhabit this kind of space, it's big already, but usually it's much smaller. And actually, Terraforma was written before the lockdown. And one of the things that we wanted to do afterward, and I think Axel is doing it at the moment, is to do models for intimate space. Exactly what you mean, exactly what you said. So I haven't seen them yet, but what is the model of the lockdown, for instance? What is the space? What is the inhabited space during the confinement? You know, and of course, it's not only during the pandemic, it's also now that we inhabit those intimate space, as you said. And it's not directly related, but a little bit. I'm trying to finish a book at the moment, which is about cosmograms. And I'm sure that as architect, you know, the beautiful concept coming from anthropology and used by STS, John Tresh, of cosmograms. What is beautiful with this is that it says something about our need of intimate space, small space, kind of human scale space, in order to understand bigger things like the Earth, the planet, and everything. So I think I'm not sure I answer your question, but I just underline the fact that it's a very pertinent one. I think the relationship between intimate space, inhabited space, human scale space, and the bigger space, and those drawings, images, models, of course, are one way to try to address this discrepancy of scale. And theater is another one for me.
We have a similar question on Zoom from Gita. I don't know, Gita, if you want to express yourself, or I can read, just because we're talking at the scale of Earth, but did you try to do this exercise of in one specific critical zone, for example, the polluted site in Lyon that you were talking about earlier? Did you try to localize more these models?
Yeah, the models are models, but then the maps are only located, only situated. So there is no such thing as global maps. It's impossible because they are lenses. They can only be used on specific territories. And the other reasons that explains why we couldn't make global things, first of all, because it's not very useful nowadays to do global. I mean, we have a lot of global things. So the whole point of Terraforma was to go elsewhere. I mean, we know the globe, we know. So yeah, the other reason is that we needed data. If you don't want to remain at the level of the model, which is a bit empty, you need data. So to go from here to there, you need years and years of data. And that was only possible because, as I told you, Axel and Alexandra are landscape architects. For instance, this one, which I like, is about Pyrenees, you know, this mountain frontier between Spain and France. And again, it's because Axel spent years working on the specific struggle problems in this area. So it doesn't look like there is a lot of data in it, but in fact, there is quite a lot of information and things she has gathered on that. What I like with this map is that they are not global. They are not finished. They are not complete. They are not fixed. It's only one moment. So they are infinite. In fact, you can just make them. You can just use them. You can just make new models depending on the questions you have. So that's why I showed you all the different ones that have been made afterwards, because we only made 7 questions in a way, you know, resources, soil, frontiers, and it's very basic, to tell you the truth. What I think now that it's very basic, it's just a manual, a project. But what is interesting is when you start to make a very, very precise, specific model to look at a very, very special, specific place. And then I think it starts to be interesting. If it starts to reveal things which you don't really see normally.
Yeah, one question here.
Yeah, just a thought when looking at the more circular diagrams. It reminds me of the diagrams of Kate Raworth, the economist, who has these. She tries to graphically represent her book Donut Economics. It's like the safe space for humanity. So you have these 2 circles, an inner circle and an outer circle, and then these transversal kind of axes that represent, say, carbon emissions or poverty or clean water. And it could be an interesting direction for this type of mapping, could be to maybe you use that sort of way of representing actual data for planetary conditions, because they can be produced for different cities or different places. So it might be.
No, that's a great idea. I'm happy if you can give me the name after,
Yeah,
because I didn't understand that.
yeah,
But you're very right in saying that this is a kind of diagrammatic more than cartographic. I mean, depending on the images, but some of them are really diagrams, more like data visualization tradition in a way. And it's true that we don't know economics at all, so we didn't look into that tradition. We were more into the kind of, as I told you, cage musical tradition, or because of me, 16th, 17th century things. But I'm pretty sure that in what they call data viz or economic diagram, there would be a lot to do, and the idea of mixing the two is quite interesting.
Could be interesting.
Thank you.
It seems through those maps you're encrypting a lot of information. I was wondering if there were any surprises coming out when you're decrypting information from them, because maybe some things are lost in the process of encapsulating the information. Sometimes maybe things are gained. So I was wondering, how do you look back at these maps and you make sense of them? Because I mean, they're graphically extremely pleasing, but I was wondering, like, how does this tool become analytical, conclusive to drawing new conclusions about the critical zone, and results that you can share with colleagues from other disciplines, for instance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I promised I would tell you what happened after Terraform, and I didn't. So this is the opportunity to do it. One way to answer you, I have 2 ways to answer you. One way is to show you that the living landscape, something that appeared that we didn't know was in it. And I don't know if somebody has the book because it's more visible in the book, is that when you draw very carefully the movements of those things, living beings, some of them are human, some of them are not human, you recognize patterns, geometrical patterns. And because we completely ignored scale here, suddenly you could see that the pattern of the movement of a wildcat near Paris was very close to the pattern of a 35-year-old, woman, for instance, for some reason, or the pattern of martinet, which is a kind of strange bird that really explores systematically the territory. It's like his pattern is very specific, looks very much like the pattern of a trading guy, doing systematic commercial stuff. So that's something we didn't really expect, and we were so amused by that. I'm not sure I have much more to say than that, but there are some geometrical ways of moving that completely relate human and non-human beings. And we discovered that with this little map, for instance. Okay, it's not a big heuristic discovery, but it's fun. What is maybe more significant is that this Terraforma book, which uses a lot of geological things, became the model for a big project called Terraforma. They used our title. You know, the kind of project we never have in social sciences, something with 30 million euros to equip the critical zone labs everywhere in France with captors. And I liked that so much because normally, you know, this relationship between natural sciences, earth system sciences, les sciences dures, comme on dit, and STS, social, SHS, social and human sciences, normally they do something hard and then we use it. But this time it was really this kind of, you know, going back effect, because they liked so much this stuff, again, not as a data producing thing, but as a kind of way to change their relationship to the territory, that they've asked us to work with them. So it's quite interesting for me to think of images as something which is not only lacking for us in architecture, design, art, or social sciences, but it's also something that is lacking in the fields of geology and earth system sciences, because this is not their job to draw images. It's your job as designers or architects. They don't know how to do that. So they were really happy to see those new images because they could relate to it. So that's one interesting point. And then there is another one which goes completely in the opposite direction, which is that this book has been made into a kind of score for an experimental Italian musician who made it into a contemporary experimental music thing. So I quite like the fact that, as you said, it can be pleasing aesthetically, so you can make it into, you know, inspiration for a work of art. But it's not only that, and it's very important for us that it's not only that. It's not supposed to be aestheticizing Gaia, because that would be terrible. So the question of aesthetics, the beauty or seduction of those images is a problem in a way. I mean, it's part of the discussion with Bruno Latour about how to attract us back on Earth, but it shouldn't be only that. It should be full of data and full of problems and full of questions.
Hi, I'm just curious about your comments about how you just couldn't get out of the circle of the sphere, and to link it back to Holling's diagram, or a kind of a process. You know, you mentioned time, for example, and I wanted to see your perspective, maybe how these diagrams might communicate process, or maybe with Bruno Latour's kind of discourse on the Anthropocene. What are your thoughts on that?
Process, you mean time?
Yes.
It's interesting because I'm not sure, and again, I'm not speaking in our benefit here, but I'm not sure that the time is a good alibi, is a good reason for us to use the circle, because here, for instance, this diagram, we used it in a play with Bruno. We used it as a video, so you can see the lines appearing and mingling and creating the space really in front of you. And this is much more interesting than a fixed diagram, of course. But again, I don't see why we need the circle to do that. Let me think in terms. This one of course, you could say it's a monad, so it, you know, you need a kind of circle to have that. And this one, it's just the reverse of the globe. So no, I don't really have a good justification. I tried many times. I don't have a good justification. Maybe there is one good one. It's the idea of, if you remember what I said at the beginning about Robert Hooke, it's the idea of the lens,
Right.
you know, the
right.
optical lens.
Mhm.
And the reason why I like this one so much is that it looks like an eye.
Yes.
I don't I don't know if you see that as well. And again, this is not something we aimed at. It's little by little we thought, oh, that's very strange. It really looks like, you know, 17th century anatomical drawings of the eye. But you see, this is very blurred answers. I'm not sure I have a good answer for this circle coming back, except if you accept that it's a game with the globe in a way.
Right.
It's to say, look, it looks like the globe, but it's not the globe. It's a critical zone. It's a local thing. It's not global, precisely.
That's an interesting perspective because it's really kind of the reversal of the gaze from the
Absolutely, you're right.
atmosphere and the
Right.
ground, the layers of the soils that you mentioned early in the lecture.
You're right. I didn't think of it that way, but I will steal your answer for the next questions, if you don't mind. It's the reversal of the gaze.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, because I found very interesting when you mentioned about mapping movement and people, and your presentation as a whole remind me a lot the exhibition Carrying the World on One's Back from Gigi Huberman.
Mhm.
And he mentioned something that from that exhibition is like a question of what is the power of an atlas, and he defined the atlas as a kind of a material form of knowledge, and that knowledge holds like some kind of hierarchy to that. So it's when mapping people, I was wondering how can we do that in a way that map inequalities and map not only movement but like certain kind of structures that are holding our society in a way. And when you reference this sort of traditional types of typography, they also reflect some sort of like epistemic control that's being carried on throughout the time. So I was wondering, how can we break that through cartography, through new types of cartography, and to be able to map also these other systems, so the same way how it's very open-minded when you bring this topic of the soil, that not only as a surface, but understand its depth and be able to express that graphically. And when you brought up people, I was thinking like, would that be possible to do that not only based on the movement, but also like the structure that kind of like segregates or unify our society in different ways? I don't know if my question makes sense, but
It does. That's very ambitious. I mean, you have to do that. I can try to answer you on the atlas. I can see that I'm very curious about this one. It was attracting my eye during the whole presentation. What is this atlas here? But it's very interesting that you're asking about the atlas, and I can try to answer you at least on that line. We were tempted, of course, to use that as a title. Atlas de l'Anthropocène. The title is already taken, okay, but it's very tempting because what is an atlas? It's a collection of maps. But precisely, and I think this, if I understand well what you said, this is precisely what we didn't want. It's a collection of maps in order to conquer territories, basically, at the origin. Not only, but a lot of the atlases are used maps, as we know. The history of cartography is linked to the military history. This is quite obvious. So the link between knowing, conquering, collecting maps, knowing the space, drawing the space is very, very strong. So in a way, what we wanted to do is to offer different kinds of maps which you can't use from outside, because the good thing with atlas is that you can use them from outside. If you don't know a territory, you have an atlas of the world or of a country. You can go everywhere and you know where you are. Our model was more like Aborigine maps, and those maps can be used only from inside. I don't know if I'm clear here, but it's the contrary of the atlas in a way. You need to know the code, you need to know the territory, and the map is not used to fight or to make war. It's used to discuss. It's a kind of dialogue tool. Yeah, so you can see that the atlas is I mean, interestingly, the atlas is also, I'm sure you know the book by Peter Gallison and Rainey Daston, a big classical book of STS, social science studies, STS. It's a book about atlases in the history of science, and it's a book about the materiality of images and how it's only through atlases of clouds, of body parts, of that science was made. So the history of objectivity is linked to the history of atlases. So I'm saying two things different here, but what I want to say is that this kind of objectivity model used and that makes the history of atlas is precisely what we try to change a little bit. But it's a bit of a paradox, because at the same time, what we offer is a series of maps. But the hope is that they are not used exactly the same way as the classical maps. I'm not sure I understood. I completely answered your question, but I used it to say something else, maybe.
Here we have in Zoom another question. Ella, thank you for the presentation, and ask you if you could elaborate a bit more about the connection between the experimental musical notation, such as the work of Cage, for example, as a new ways of mapping the living. And it seems super exciting, this synthesis, the idea of bringing these two together, yes.
Yes, then I need to answer that, I need to do a little detour through the idea of notation. Notation. Before Terraforma, Alexandra and Axel spent almost 1 year working on little forest in the north of France called Belleval. And they had the idea to use the tools of all the things that were living on this forest. The forest keeper, comment on dit, les chasseurs. Hunters, thank you. But also the GPS on the animals. They had the idea to take every possible captor in order to note the movements in this little forest. So as you can see, this is the idea behind this one. The reason why I'm saying that is that for us, there is a strong link between arts of noticing by Anna Tsing, les arts de remarquer, et la notation. Sorry, my English is gone when I try to be subtle. Les arts de remarquer, les arts de noter, et la notation. All this is very much related. So the point was really, how can we invent, or not invent because it's always already invented, but how can we reuse the techniques that were developed by contemporary music, but as I told you, also by contemporary dance, to note, put in drawing something which is difficult to grasp. And the link really is there. It's in the difficulty to, but also the, not only the difficulty, but the pleasure, I would say, of noter. So a lot of this is about, I would say, to put it bluntly, a philosophy of attention. How do you get more attentive? So you just need to develop tools. And again, those ones are very sketchy. It's only the beginning. But if you start to think in terms of making yourself attentive again, then suddenly you want to take inspiration from dance, music, jazz, drawing, painting, all the arts of noticing, basically. And then it's a way to be interdisciplinary, which is completely new. It's not, okay, it's, the link with really is attention. It's not only space or how to represent or sound, time, music. No, the link is how do you get yourself more attentive, because we lost our, as we know, we lost our capacities of attention. So we need to rebuild them in a way.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you have more comments or any question. I personally really appreciate to listen to an historian of sciences talking about the orthodoxy, and also where, I mean, from what I understood, also on your last comment, interdisciplinarity is not something so evident to build and so objective. So it probably asks for such an explorative approach also, and maybe it's allowed to go beyond the orthodoxy of each discipline, of course. I was also wondering during your presentation how much, I mean, why, to your question, why architects and architectural schools are more aware about your discourse, maybe more than others discipline, including cartography, as you introduced. And maybe also because, and maybe you could give some element of understanding, but maybe architecture and urban planning or at the front, no, or asked by the ecological challenging to be rethought totally. So we are managing a lot of shifts in our discipline, and probably in the history architecture I've killed the father many times about being in a position of the previous state of thinking, but probably it's facing a strong need for reinventing the discipline, and probably also in the school and the way we're teaching and so on. Probably architecture is one of the sciences that is really going beyond the orthodoxy of its own discipline. And actually architectural education and discourse is always going beyond and trying to get more information and more connection with a lot of fields. I personally appreciate that you remind that also the main tools of architecture are still valid for many kind of connection between the fields. So not only forgetting our own patrimony heritage, but I'm also wondering how much this is something for all disciplines, all sciences, or how much the architecture and the way we are conceiving urban and territorial planning are probably asking for this kind of representation, change of gaze, etc., etc. So this is something really important for me, the point you're raising, and this is probably why you have more success in the School of Architecture. I don't know if you want to.
So, I mean, success, I don't know, but at least curiosity.
Curiosity, yes.
And I think you're absolutely right. Architecture is at the front line, and it's obvious with our discussion about inhabiting, existing, building, noticing. I mean, we can feel that these are all the topics which are linked to ways of inhabiting the world today. So it's absolutely crucial. And again, you are the architect, so you know better than me, but from the outside, what I see, and this is really striking for me, is that I have the feeling that you really have the two directions at the moment, the architects who want to continue business as usual, and they think, yes, it's important to make, you know, architectural statements, to make buildings, it's, you know, and the others, and I have lots of them in my school, who just quit their their architectural cabinet. I don't know if it's in English, but they just
the
stop.
offices, yes.
Offices, they just quit the offices to do a PhD or to do SPIP or to do art or to do other things, or they do architecture in a completely new way, like not building kind of architecture, using the tools to do something else. And I'm really curious to know where you situate yourself. But it's obvious that urban planning is one of the big challenges for sustainability, for politics, for everything. So I think being an architect today really means to position oneself in relation to those topics. And what I hope is that those two trends that I can see, they don't remain as in this kind of opposition. So I don't know, I want to ask you the question, what can you see in your students, in your work, this kind of two trends? I mean, obviously, when I met Dieter Dietz 2 years ago around the book, I thought, wow, they're doing exactly the kind of new architecture I was dreaming of. And my feeling is that, I mean, the reason why I'm invited to Lausanne frequently is maybe because what's happening here is a bit different.
Yeah, probably it's deconstructing a bit the tools and the orthodoxy way. But I like also the way you are referring to the 70th century, also coming back also to previous stage of state of art, no? Because this also can be relevant when finding the way. Between the two trains, I think tomorrow the EPFL is hosting tomorrow and on Thursday a 2-day seminar questioning the Baukultur, so the culture of the built environment. And absolutely the two trends you are discussing put on one side the heritage or the way we are conceiving the culture of the built since now centuries, and an emerging culture, the one of the transition, as we are studying here at PFL, at least with the Habitat Research Center, that it's another driving culture, that an emerging one, and probably you can find some match and mismatches between these two cultures. And we do the hypothesis in the Habitat Research Center and the several research we are carrying, and also including the teaching activities we have, including this mass. The hypothesis that through representation, you can also reconnect, you know, to culture or find bridges between and find some certain, not compromise, but another trajectories that can be probably found through the representation of the things and the way it obliges you to change the gaze on realities. So I think it's exactly what we have learned tonight from your presentation. And maybe with this word, we can conclude if you have no specific feedbacks. And thanks again for the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for the discussion.
Thanks for the audience online, and for those that were here, we can just have share a beer together if you want outside. Thank you. Yes.